The centuries roll backward. The empire breathes again. The call to prayer drifts across a skyline crowned with lead-sheathed domes and slender minarets, and the waters of the Bosphorus shimmer beneath a pale morning sun. Cobalt blue and turquoise tiles gleam along the walls of imperial mosques. The scent of cedar and rosewater lingers in courtyards paved with polished marble. This is Istanbul, once Constantinople, the city where two continents meet and where one of the longest reigning dynasties in human history made its home for nearly 500 years. But the story does not begin here. It begins far to the east, in the misty highlands of northwestern Anatolia, where a small band of Turkic horsemen gathered beneath the banner of a chieftain named Osman at the close of the 13th century. No one could have imagined that this modest frontier beylik, wedged between crumbling Byzantine fortresses and rival Turkish warlords, would grow into a dominion stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates, from the gates of Vienna to the sun-scorched coasts of North Africa, enduring for more than 600 years. This is the complete story of the Ottoman Empire, told from its very first breath to its final transformation. We will journey from those nomadic encampments beneath the slopes of Uludağ Mountain to the thundering cannons that shattered the Theodosian walls on that fateful May morning in 1453. We will walk through the vaulted corridors of the Grand Bazaar, where merchants traded silk and saffron beneath stone arches blackened by centuries of lamplight. We will stand in the radiant interior of the Suleimaniye Mosque at dawn, where Mimar Sinan's genius turned stone and light into something eternal. We will witness the rise of Suleiman the lawgiver, whose empire commanded 5 million square kilometers and whose legal codes governed millions of souls across 3 continents. We will enter the tiled chambers of the Topkapi Harem, where powerful women like Hürrem Sultan and Kösem Sultan shaped the fate of nations from behind cedarwood lattice screens. And we will follow the long, painful arc of decline from the catastrophic defeat at Vienna in 1683 through the desperate reforms of the Tanzimat, the revolutions of the Young Turks, the trenches of Gallipoli, and the final abolition of a dynasty that had endured since the age of the Crusades. What unfolds across this series is not merely a chronicle of sultans and sieges. It is the story of how a civilization synthesized the traditions of Central Asia, Persia, Byzantium, and the Arab world into something entirely new. Ottoman cuisine, Ottoman music, Ottoman architecture, and Ottoman law continue to shape the lives of hundreds of millions of people across more than 30 modern nations. The borders drawn during Ottoman rule still define the map of the Middle East and southeastern Europe. The mosques Sinan built still stand. The coffee houses that first appeared in Istanbul in the 1550s still anchor the social life of cities from Cairo to Sarajevo. This is a journey through 6 centuries of ambition, artistry, conquest, and transformation. By its end, the full arc of one of history's most extraordinary civilizations will be revealed, from a handful of warriors on a forgotten frontier to an empire that bridged the medieval and modern worlds. If these complete journeys through the great civilizations of the past speak to something deep within, please subscribe so that no chapter of this ongoing exploration is missed. Each week brings the full story of another world that time has tried to bury. Now, let us begin our journey. Mist clings to the highlands of Sout like a burial shroud that refuses to lift. The valleys of northwestern Anatolia fold into one another, dense with oak and pine, cut by streams that run cold even in summer. On the ridgelines, crumbling Byzantine watchtowers stand half abandoned, their garrisons thinned by decades of neglect from a Constantinople too exhausted to defend its own frontier. Below them, felt tents cluster in seasonal encampments, their smoke rising through the grey air. This is the borderland, the UC, where neither empire nor order holds firm, and where something new is about to take root. The 13th century has been merciless to Anatolia. The Mongol victory at Kosedar in 1243 shattered the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, reducing its sultans to Ilkhanid vassals. In the vacuum, dozens of Turkic beyliks spring up like wild flowers after a fire. The Karamanolu, the Germiyanids, the Kandarids, the Aydunids, each carving territory from the Seljuk carcass. Among the smallest and most obscure is the beylik led by Ertuğrul, a tribal chieftain granted pasture lands near Söğüt by the Seljuk Sultan in exchange for guarding the Byzantine frontier. Ertuğrul's son, Osman, inherits leadership around 1299. He is a Ghazi, a frontier warrior devoted to raiding and expanding the borders of the Islamic world, but he is also a pragmatist. Osman forges alliances not only with fellow Turkmen warriors, but with Sufi dervish orders, particularly the Ahis, an urban brotherhood of craftsmen and mystics whose networks stretch across Anatolian towns. The Bababis, followers of the heterodox dervish Baba Ilyas, also lend spiritual legitimacy to his cause. A famous legend, recorded by later chroniclers, tells of Osman dreaming that a great tree grows from his body, its branches shading mountains, rivers, and seas. The dream, interpreted by the Sufi Sheikh Edebali, whose daughter Osman marries, becomes a founding myth, a prophecy of empire whispered around campfires for generations. What distinguishes Osman from rival bey leaders is geography. His beylik sits directly on the Byzantine frontier in Bithynia, granting him constant access to raiding opportunities and the prestige that comes with Ghazi warfare. Byzantine border lords, weakened and isolated, sometimes defect to his side. Greek-speaking converts, Turkmen nomads, wandering dervishes, and displaced Seljuk administrators all find a place within Osman's growing polity. Identity here is fluid, defined less by ethnicity than by loyalty and faith. Through the early decades of the 1400s, Osman's forces press deeper into Byzantine Bithynia, besieging fortified towns and cutting supply lines. The prize is Bursa, a wealthy city nestled at the foot of Uludağ Mountain, famous for its thermal springs and silk trade. The siege lasts years. Osman himself does not live to see its fall. He dies around 1326, and it is his son Orhan who enters the city as conqueror. Bursa becomes the first Ottoman capital. Its transformation begins immediately. Mosques rise alongside converted churches. A bazaar takes shape in the commercial quarter. Early Ottoman coins are struck bearing Orhan's name, small silver akçe pieces that circulate through the frontier markets, tangible evidence of sovereign authority. The city's position at the terminus of the Silk Road's Anatolian branch ensures revenue. Orhan establishes a rudimentary administration, appointing judges and governors, moving beyond tribal raiding toward something resembling a state. The snow-capped summit of Uludağ towers above the new capital, visible from every minaret and marketplace. Caravans arrive bearing goods from Tabriz and Aleppo. Dervish lodges offer food and shelter to travelers. The felt tents of the frontier have not disappeared, but beside them now stand walls of cut stone and roofs of lead. A bay-like born between dying empires begins, quietly and without fanfare, to build something that will outlast them both. The walls of Nicaea have witnessed centuries of Christian councils and Byzantine governance, but in 1331, Ottoman siege engines batter those ancient fortifications until the garrison surrenders. Orhan's forces enter the city where the Nicene Creed was once formulated, and the cross atop the great church gives way to the crescent. 6 years later, Nicomedia falls in 1337, and with it the last significant Byzantine stronghold in northwestern Anatolia. The eastern shore of the Sea of Marmara belongs entirely to the Ottomans, yet the narrow strait of the Dardanelles still separates two continents. In 1354, a devastating earthquake shatters the walls of Gallipoli, and Orhan's son Suleiman Pasha seizes the ruined fortress before Byzantine engineers can repair it. Ottoman warriors cross from Asia into Europe not through grand invasion, but through opportunism and rubble. Gallipoli becomes a bridgehead of extraordinary strategic consequence, a permanent foothold on the Thracian shore from which cavalry raids fan outward across the Balkans. Orhan dies around 1362, and his son Murad ascends to power with ambitions that dwarf his father's. Murad's armies push deep into Thrace, capturing Philippopolis, and then, in 1369, the great city of Adrianople, Edirne, which becomes the new Ottoman capital. The shift is deliberate. Edirne sits at the confluence of the Tunka and Maritsa rivers, commanding the roads leading to Constantinople, Belgrade, and Sofia simultaneously. Its position declares Ottoman intent. This empire now faces west. Murad constructs mosques, bathhouses, and administrative buildings in Edirne, transforming a conquered Byzantine city into an Ottoman seat of governance. He establishes the office of Beylerbey to administer European provinces and divides his expanding territories into military administrative districts called sanjaks. The Timar system grants cavalrymen land revenues in exchange for military service, creating a feudal structure that binds the army to the soil it conquers. The most consequential innovation emerges quietly during these decades. The devshirme, a levy of Christian boys from Balkan villages, begins taking shape as state policy. These children are converted to Islam, educated in Turkish language and Ottoman customs, and trained for either administrative service or military duty. The finest among them enter the Janissary Corps, an elite infantry force loyal exclusively to the Sultan. Armed with bows, swords, and eventually firearms, the Janissaries answer to no local lord or tribal chieftain. They are the Sultan's own weapon, forged from the empire's conquered populations. By the late 1380s, Ottoman dominion stretches across Thrace, Macedonia, and parts of Bulgaria. Serbian, Bosnian, and Albanian lords watch this expansion with mounting alarm. Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović of Serbia assembles a coalition to halt the Ottoman advance. The two armies meet on the field of Kosovo on the 15th of June, 1389. The plain stretches flat beneath a pale sky, bordered by low hills. Murad commands a force of perhaps 30,000, facing a coalition of comparable size. The battle is savage and prolonged. Ottoman discipline and Janissary resilience grind against Serbian heavy cavalry and Bosnian infantry. By afternoon, the coalition fractures. Prince Lazar is captured and executed, but Murad does not survive his victory. A Serbian noble, tradition names him Miloš Obilić, penetrates the Ottoman lines and assassinates the sultan. Murad's son Bayezid, present on the battlefield, immediately assumes command and secures the succession by ordering the execution of his brother Yaqub. The field of Kosovo becomes sacred ground for both civilizations. For the Serbs, it crystallizes into a myth of noble sacrifice and martyrdom that will echo through centuries of national consciousness. For the Ottomans, it confirms that the Balkans are theirs to hold. The empire that began in, felt tense along the Bithynian frontier, now governs populations speaking Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Albanian. Its capital sits in Europe. Its army includes soldiers born Christian and raised Ottoman. The crossing of the Dardanelles, accomplished through an earthquake's gift, has altered the trajectory of an entire continent. Bayezid inherits his father's throne on a battlefield still slick with blood, and he governs as though the earth itself might be seized before sundown. The Ottomans call him Yildirim, Thunderbolt, for the terrifying speed with which he moves armies across vast distances. Within a decade of Kosovo, he swallows the rival Anatolian beyliks one after another. Saruhan, Aydin, Menteşe, Germiyan, Hamid, and Karaman fall under Ottoman control through conquest or coerced submission. The patchwork of independent Turkish principalities that once fragmented Anatolia dissolves into a single dominion stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. In the west, Bayezid tightens the noose around Constantinople. Ottoman fortifications rise along the Bosphorus, and the ancient Byzantine capital, already shrunken to a fraction of its former population, endures a grinding blockade. The Byzantine emperor, desperate, appeals to the Christian kingdoms of Europe. The response comes in 1396. A massive crusader army, perhaps the largest assembled since the fall of Acre a century earlier, marches southward under the command of Sigismund of Hungary. French, Burgundian, German, and Hungarian knights converge on the Danubian fortress city of Nicopolis, confident in their numbers and heavy cavalry. The confidence proves fatal. On the 25th of September, the Crusader vanguard charges uphill into Ottoman lines without coordination. Bayezid's disciplined infantry absorbs the assault, and his cavalry, held in reserve behind the hills, encircles the exhausted knights. The slaughter is comprehensive. Thousands of crusaders are killed or captured. Sigismund barely escapes by boat down the Danube to the Black Sea. Nicopolis shatters the last organized European attempt to halt Ottoman expansion for over half a century. Yet Bayezid's appetite for conquest creates the conditions for catastrophe. His absorption of Anatolian beyliks displaces local dynasties whose dispossessed rulers flee eastward, seeking the protection of the one power capable of challenging the thunderbolt. Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror who has already devastated Persia, Mesopotamia, India, and the Golden Horde. Timur demands that Bayezid restore the Anatolian beyliks. Bayezid refuses with contempt. The collision comes on the 20th of July, 1402, on the plain of Chubuk near Ankara. Timur commands perhaps 140,000 soldiers, including armored war elephants from his Indian campaigns. Bayezid fields a comparable force, but his army is fatally compromised. The Anatolian troops, many of them recently conscripted from conquered beyliks, defect to Timur during the battle, rejoining their former lords who ride in Timur's ranks. The Ottoman line collapses. Bayezid fights until surrounded and is taken prisoner, the first and only Ottoman sultan captured in battle. He dies in Timurid captivity within months, the circumstances debated by chroniclers for centuries. Timur dismantles the Ottoman state with surgical precision, restoring the Anatolian beyliks and dividing Ottoman territory among Bayezid's surviving sons. The empire that seemed destined to devour Constantinople instead fragments into warring principalities. Suleiman controls Thrace and the European provinces from Edirne. Isa holds Bursa briefly before Mehmed eliminates him. Musa crosses into Europe and overthrows Suleiman. For 11 years, the Ottoman interregnum rages, brother against brother, province against province, the dynasty consuming itself. It is Mehmed, the youngest, who prevails. Operating from the Anatolian interior, he methodically defeats his siblings, secures the loyalty of the remaining Janissaries, and reunifies the fractured state by 1413. His reign is one of careful reconstruction rather than dramatic conquest. The Green Mosque in Bursa, commissioned during his rule, rises in luminous turquoise and blue tile work, its serene geometry a deliberate statement of renewal after chaos. The hexagonal tiles glow with floral arabesques in cobalt and white, as if the empire itself is being reassembled piece by careful piece. The interregnum leaves permanent scars on Ottoman political consciousness. Never again will the dynasty assume its survival is guaranteed. The lesson of Ankara, that overreach invites annihilation, tempers the ambitions of Mehmed's successors, at least for a generation. The empire that emerges from this crucible is leaner, warier, and more administratively disciplined. It has stared into the void of extinction and pulled itself back. Murad II inherits a state chastened by catastrophe, and he governs with the patience of a man who understands that empires are rebuilt stone by stone. Through the 1420s and 30s, Ottoman armies reclaim territories lost during the interregnum. Thessalonica falls in 1430, its Venetian garrison overwhelmed after a brief siege. The Balkans are methodically reabsorbed. Murad fortifies the Taimar system, binding cavalry soldiers to agricultural land grants in exchange for military service, creating a self-sustaining war machine that requires no standing treasury to feed. Yet Christendom has not abandoned its ambitions. In 1444, a Crusader army led by the young King Władysław of Poland and Hungary marches south toward the Black Sea coast. Murad, who has briefly abdicated in favor of his adolescent son Mehmed, returns from retirement to command the Ottoman forces. On the plains outside Varna on November 10th, 1444, the two armies collide. The Crusader cavalry charges with devastating force, but Murad holds his center. Władysław himself rides into the Ottoman lines and is killed. His head is raised on a pike. The Crusade of Varna collapses in a single afternoon. 4 years later, at the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448, Murad crushes a Hungarian army under János Hunyadi, confirming Ottoman supremacy in the Balkans for a generation. When Murad dies in 1451, his son Mehmed ascends the throne for the second time, now 19 years old and consumed by a single obsession, Constantinople. The city is a shadow of its former grandeur, its population dwindled to perhaps 50,000 souls, rattling inside walls built for 500,000. But those walls, the Theodosian fortifications, a triple line of limestone and a brick stretching 6.5 kilometers across the peninsula, have repelled every siege for 1,000 years. Mehmed's preparations are methodical and terrifying. In 1452, he constructs Rumeli Hizara on the European shore of the Bosphorus in just 4 months. its 3 great towers of cut stone choking the strait opposite the older fortress of Anadolu Hisara on the Asian side. No ship passes without Ottoman permission. He commissions the Hungarian cannon founder Urban to cast a bronze bombard over 8 meters long, capable of hurling stone balls weighing more than half a ton. The weapon requires 60 oxen and 200 men to transport. The siege begins on April 6, 1453. Mehmed's army, perhaps 80,000 strong, encircles the land walls while an Ottoman fleet of over 100 vessels blockades the Sea of Marmara. The Byzantines stretch a massive iron chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn, denying Ottoman ships access to the harbour. Mehmed's response is audacious. He orders 70 vessels hauled overland on greased wooden rails across the hills behind Galata, bypassing the chain entirely. The ships slide into the Golden Horn, and Constantinople is surrounded. For 53 days, the great bombards pound the Theodosian walls. Sections crumble and are rebuilt overnight by desperate defenders under the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI commands a garrison of barely 7,000 against an army more than 10 times its size. The final assault comes before dawn on May the 29th. Ottoman waves crash against the walls in successive attacks, first irregular troops, then Anatolian regulars, then the elite Janissaries. A small postern gate, the Kerke Porta, is found unlocked or broken open. Janissaries pour through. Giustiniani is wounded and carried to a ship. The defense fractures. Constantine XI charges into the Ottoman ranks and is never seen alive again. By midday, Mehmed rides through the shattered gates. He proceeds directly to the Hagia Sophia, its vast dome still soaring above a city now silent with shock. Sunlight falls through 40 windows, ringing the base of the dome, illuminating gold mosaics of Christ and the Virgin. Mehmed orders the building converted into a mosque. The call to prayer echoes beneath a ceiling that has heard Christian liturgy for 916 years. The Byzantine Empire, which traced its lineage to Rome itself, ceases to exist. A new age begins on the Bosphorus. The conquered city lies quiet in the weeks that follow, its population reduced to perhaps 50,000 souls, a fraction of the 500,000 who once filled its forums and harbours. Mehmed II, now styled Fatih, the conqueror, surveys a metropolis of crumbling aqueducts, overgrown gardens, and depopulated quarters where entire neighbourhoods stand empty. He intends to resurrect it as the capital of a world empire. The transformation begins with the Hagia Sophia. Minarets rise at its corners, a mihrab is carved into the southeastern wall to orient prayer toward Mecca, and the golden mosaics of Christian saints are gradually plastered over rather than destroyed. The building becomes a mosque, but its Byzantine bones remain, the same pendentives, the same cascading half-domes, the same ethereal light filtering through the corona of windows. Ottoman and Roman engineering now share a single roof. Mehmed issues decrees of surgun, forced resettlement, drawing populations from across his domains. Greek families from the Morea, Armenian merchants from Bursa, Muslim artisans from Aksaray, Jewish communities from Edirne, all are compelled to relocate to the capital. By 1470, Istanbul's population climbs past 100,000. The city becomes deliberately, systematically cosmopolitan, its neighborhoods organized by trade and faith. On the ancient Acropolis of Byzantium, where the promontory commands both the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, Construction begins on Topkapi Palace. Completed in stages through the 1460s and 70s, it is not a single monumental structure, but a sequence of courtyards, pavilions, gardens, and chambers spreading across the headland. The imperial gate opens into the first courtyard, a public space where the state meets its subjects. Beyond the gate of salutation lies the second courtyard, where the imperial council, the divan, conducts the business of empire beneath a towered chamber. The third courtyard, accessible only to the sultan and his inner circle, houses the audience chamber, the treasury, and the sacred relics. The palace breathes with the rhythms of governance, petitions heard, taxes assessed, ambassadors received. Below the palace hill, the grand bazaar takes shape. 2 stone bedestens, vaulted market halls with thick walls and iron doors, anchor a growing web of covered streets. Silk merchants, jewelers, spice dealers, and weaponsmiths fill the stalls. The bazaar becomes the commercial heart of an empire that straddles trade routes linking Persia to Venice. Mehmed commissions the Fatih Mosque complex, completed in 1470, on the site of the ruined Church of the Holy Apostles. 8 madrasas, a hospital, a caravanserai, a library, and a public kitchen surround the central mosque. The Kuliya model, an integrated social complex, becomes the Ottoman template for urban development, binding worship, education, charity, and commerce into a single architectural organism. The conqueror's ambitions extend far beyond his capital. Ottoman armies absorb Serbia in 1459, extinguishing the last despotate. The Morea falls in 1460. Trebizond, the final remnant of Byzantine civilization on the Black Sea coast, surrenders in 1461. Mehmed campaigns into Wallachia, subdues Bosnia, and fights Venice in a war lasting 16 years. In 1480, an Ottoman force crosses the Adriatic and captures Otranto in southern Italy, planting the Sultan's banner on the Italian peninsula itself. Mehmed governs through codified law. His Kanunname organizes the empire into a hierarchy of military, administrative, and religious classes. It regulates taxation, land tenure, and criminal punishment. One provision, stark in its pragmatism, permits a newly enthroned sultan to execute his brothers to prevent civil war, a codification of fratricide as state policy, born from the memory of the interregnum's devastation. The sultan himself speaks 6 languages: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Serbian. He collects manuscripts, commissions Italian painters, and debates philosophy with Greek scholars retained at his court. Istanbul under his rule is neither purely Eastern nor Western, but something unprecedented, a capital that absorbs civilizations rather than erasing them. When Mehmed dies on campaign in 1481, at the age of 49, he leaves behind a city reborn and an empire that stretches from the Danube to the Euphrates. The skyline of Istanbul, domes, minarets, and cypress trees silhouetted against the waters of the Bosphorus, has assumed the shape it will hold for centuries. Bayezid II ascends the throne not through battlefield glory, but through the quieter mechanics of court politics, outmaneuvering his brother Cem Sultan, who flees into European exile and becomes a diplomatic pawn of the papacy and the Knights of St. John. For nearly 3 decades, Bayezid governs with a temperament his father would scarcely recognize: contemplative, pious, cautious. The Bayezid Mosque complex rising in Istanbul between 1497 and 1501 reflects this disposition. Its vast courtyard breathes with open space, its single dome resting on broad arches with a serenity that favors meditation over spectacle. Yet beneath this calm surface, consequential decisions reshape the empire. In 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella expel the Jews of Spain, Bayezid dispatches Ottoman ships to Iberian ports. Tens of thousands of Sephardic refugees settle in Salonika, Istanbul, and Izmir, carrying with them expertise in medicine, printing, metallurgy, and international trade. Salonika becomes the largest Jewish city in the world. The Ottoman treasury benefits directly from this influx of skilled artisans and merchants, and the empire's commercial networks extend deeper into European markets. Bayezid also invests heavily in naval expansion, recognizing that Mediterranean power demands more than cavalry. Ottoman shipyards multiply along the Aegean and Black Sea coasts, but his reluctance to wage aggressive war frustrates his youngest son, Selim, governor of Trabzon, who watches the Safavid dynasty under Shah Ismail spread militant Shia influence into eastern Anatolia. In 1512, Selim forces his aging father's abdication and takes the throne. Bayezid dies weeks later on the road to retirement in Didimo-Techo. Selim I earns the epithet Yavuz, the Grimms, almost immediately. He eliminates rival brothers and nephews with ruthless efficiency, then turns the full weight of the empire eastward. The Safavid threat is existential. Ismail's Kizilbash followers have ignited revolts among Anatolian Turkmen tribes, challenging Ottoman religious and political authority. In the summer of 1514, Selim marches an army of perhaps 100,000 men across the harsh eastern plateau. The Safavid forces, superb horsemen but lacking gunpowder artillery, meet the Ottomans at Chaldiran on August 23rd. Ottoman cannons and Janissary muskets devastate the Kizilbash cavalry. Ismail flees the field. Selim briefly occupies the Safavid capital of Tabriz, though logistical constraints force withdrawal. The victory secures eastern Anatolia and establishes a frontier with Persia that will endure for centuries. Selim then pivots southward toward the Mamluk Sultanate, which controls Syria, Egypt, and the holy cities of the Hejaz. At Marj Dabik, north of Aleppo, on August 24th of 1516, Ottoman artillery again proves decisive against Mamluk cavalry. The Mamluk Sultan Kansuh al-Gawri dies in the battle. Damascus, Jerusalem, and the great cities of the Levant fall in rapid succession. 5 months later, at Redania outside Cairo on January 22nd of 1517, the last Mamluk Sultan Tuman Bey is defeated and subsequently hanged at the Bab Zuwayla Gate. The conquest of Egypt transforms the Ottoman Empire from a regional power into a global one. Control of the Red Sea trade routes connecting the Indian Ocean spice trade to Mediterranean markets fills the imperial treasury. The custodianship of Mecca and Medina grants the Ottoman Sultan a spiritual authority that transcends politics. The title servant of the 2 holy sanctuaries carries weight across the entire Islamic world. The last Abbasid caliph, a figurehead maintained by the Mamluks in Cairo, transfers his symbolic authority to the Ottoman dynasty. In 8 years on the throne, Selim doubles the empire's territory. The citadel of Cairo, once the seat of Mamluk power, now flies Ottoman banners. Grain from the Nile Delta feeds Istanbul. Egyptian craftsmen, scholars, and administrators are absorbed into the imperial system. When Selim dies in 1520 at the age of 49, likely from a cancerous infection, the empire he leaves to his only surviving son stretches from the Balkans to the cataracts of the Nile, from the Euphrates to the shores of the Adriatic. The stage is set for the reign that will define the Ottoman Golden Age. Suleiman ascends the throne in 1520 at the age of 25, the sole surviving son of a father who eliminated all rivals. The empire he inherits is vast, wealthy, and militarily formidable, yet the new sultan wastes no time demonstrating that he intends to surpass every predecessor. Within a year of his accession, Ottoman armies march north toward Belgrade, the fortress city that guards the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, the gateway to the Hungarian plain. Previous sultans attempted and failed to take it. Suleiman succeeds in 1521 after a siege of barely 3 weeks, his sappers undermining the walls while heavy bombardment reduces the garrison's will to resist. The fall of Belgrade sends tremors through the courts of Europe. The following year, Ottoman galleys descend upon Rhodes, the fortified island stronghold of the Knights of St. John, who have harassed Muslim shipping for 2 centuries. The siege lasts from June to December of 1522. The knights, numbering only a few hundred alongside several thousand defenders, hold out with extraordinary tenacity behind concentric walls and deep moats. Suleiman commits over 100,000 troops. When the fortress finally capitulates, the Sultan permits the surviving knights to depart with their arms and banners, a gesture of magnanimity that enhances his reputation across the Mediterranean. 4 years later, the Hungarian plain witnesses the most decisive battle of Suleiman's reign. On August 29, 1526, the Ottoman army meets the forces of King Louis II at Mohács. The engagement lasts barely 2 hours. Hungarian heavy cavalry charges directly into Ottoman cannon fire and Janissary musket volleys. The king drowns fleeing across a swollen stream. 20,000 Hungarian soldiers perish. The Kingdom of Hungary effectively ceases to exist as an independent power, its territory partitioned between Ottoman provinces and Habsburg claims. Suleiman presses deeper into Europe. In 1529, Ottoman forces appear before the walls of Vienna, the seat of Habsburg power. Rain-soaked roads have delayed the heavy siege artillery, and the garrison mounts a determined defense. After roughly 3 weeks of assaults and mining operations, the onset of autumn and extended supply lines compel withdrawal. Vienna holds, but the message is unmistakable. Ottoman armies can strike at the heart of Christian Europe. The Sultan's ambitions extend eastward as well. In 1534, Ottoman forces capture Baghdad from the Safavid dynasty, securing Mesopotamia and its storied cities. The tomb of Abu Hanifa, founder of the Hanafi legal school followed by most Ottoman subjects, is restored and embellished. Yet Suleiman's epithet among his own people is not conqueror, but lawgiver. He commissions a sweeping codification of Kanun, secular law governing taxation, land tenure, criminal penalties, and the status of subject populations. These codes harmonize customary practice with the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, creating a legal framework of remarkable coherence. Provincial law codes are tailored to local conditions in Egypt, Hungary, and Iraq, acknowledging the empire's diversity while binding it under a single sovereign authority. Diplomatically, Suleiman forges an alliance with Francis I of France against their mutual Habsburg enemy, a partnership that scandalizes Christendom but reflects cold strategic logic. French and Ottoman interests converge in the Mediterranean and along the Danube frontier. By the mid-1540s, the empire encompasses approximately 5.2 million square kilometers. From the walls of Buda to the banks of the Tigris, from the shores of the Crimea to the deserts of Yemen, Suleiman presides over a dominion of staggering scale. His court attracts poets, jurists, and artisans. His legal codes will outlast his military conquests by centuries. The empire has reached its fullest territorial expression, and the sultan who commands it is only halfway through his reign. In the workshops along the Golden Horn, a former military engineer from the Anatolian village of Aornus begins reshaping the skyline of an empire. Koka Mimar Sinan, recruited through the devshirme system as a Christian youth, converted to Islam, and trained in the Janissary Corps, has spent decades building bridges, fortifications, and aqueducts on campaign, before Sultan Suleiman appoints him chief imperial architect in 1539. He is nearly 50 years old. The next half-century of his life will produce more than 350 structures across 3 continents. His first major commission arrives wrapped in grief. Prince Mehmed, Suleiman's beloved son, dies in 1543, and the Sultan orders a memorial mosque. The Shehzada Mosque, completed in 1548, rises on Istanbul's third hill, with a symmetrical cascade of domes and half-domes. Sinan later calls it his apprentice work, a structure where he is still learning the grammar of monumental space. The proportions are elegant but cautious, the engineering sound but not yet daring. The masterwork comes next. The Suleymaniye Mosque, completed in 1557 on Istanbul's highest hill, commands the Golden Horn with a dome spanning 26.5 meters, rising 53 meters above the prayer hall floor. Sinan solves the problem of lateral thrust through 4 massive piers, 2 half-domes, and carefully placed buttresses disguised within the exterior walls. The interior floods with light from 138 windows, some filled with stained glass by the master glazier known as Sarhosh Ibrahim. The complex surrounding the mosque includes 4 madrasas, a hospital, a public kitchen serving the poor, a caravanserai, a hammam, and Suleiman's own mausoleum. It is not merely a mosque, but a small city dedicated to learning, charity, and worship. Meanwhile, the kilns of Iznik reach their artistic peak. Ceramic workshops produce tiles glazed in cobalt blue, turquoise, emerald green, and a distinctive raised coral red, achieved through a slip of Armenian bowl beneath a clear glaze. The chemistry is exacting. The quartz-frit body must be fired at precisely the right temperature to fuse with tin-lead glazes without cracking. These tiles sheath the interiors of mosques, palaces, and tombs across the empire, transforming stone walls into gardens of geometric and floral splendor. Tulips, carnations, hyacinths, and spiraling arabesques bloom across every surface. In the calligrapher's studios, masters of the 6 canonical scripts, Thuluth, Naskh, Muhakkak, Raihani, Tawqi, and Rika, produce Quranic manuscripts and imperial edicts of breathtaking precision. The art of hat demands years of apprenticeship, and the finest practitioners hold honored positions at court. Miniature painters working in the Nakashan within Topkapi Palace illustrate histories, festival books, and albums with meticulous scenes rendered in vivid pigment and gold leaf, depicting sieges, processions, and courtly gatherings with documentary exactness. Sinan continues building through the reign of Selim II. In Edirne, between 1568 and 1575, he constructs the Selimiye Mosque, the structure he considers his true masterpiece. Its dome, spanning 31.5 meters, surpasses the Hagia Sophia's by a slim margin, a feat Seinen achieves through an octagonal support system of 8 pillars that opens the interior into a single, uninterrupted prayer space. Light pours through the drum windows, and Iznik tiles of the finest period cover the Sultan's loge in patterns of almost hallucinatory intricacy. Sinan dies in 1588 at approximately 98 years of age. His modest tomb stands at a street corner near the Suleymaniye, humble beside the monuments he raised. The empire's cultural zenith is inseparable from his vision, a synthesis of structural daring, mathematical precision, and spiritual aspiration that transforms stone, lead, and light into spaces of transcendent calm. The buildings endure, their domes still catching the first light of morning over Istanbul and Edirne, testaments to an age when imperial ambition and artistic genius converged in perfect equilibrium. The sea that separates continents also connects them, and the empire that masters its currents commands the flow of grain, gold, and gunpowder. By the 1530s, Ottoman ambition has turned decisively toward the Mediterranean, and the instrument of that ambition is a man born not in the Sultan's court, but on the Aegean island of Lesbos, a corsair's son who will become the most feared admiral of his age. Hayreddin Barbarossa begins his career raiding Christian shipping alongside his brother Oruç from bases along the North African coast. After Oruç falls in battle against the Spanish in 1518, Hayreddin pledges allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan, transforming freelance piracy into imperial strategy. Suleiman appoints him Capudan Pasha in 1533, and Barbarossa immediately sets about rebuilding the Ottoman fleet into a force capable of challenging any power in the Western Mediterranean. Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli become Ottoman provinces, their harbors sheltering corsair fleets that raid the coasts of Spain, Italy, and Sicily with devastating regularity. The Terzain, the imperial naval arsenal sprawling along the Golden Horn in the Kasımpaşa district, operates at an almost industrial tempo. Timber from the Black Sea forests arrives by the shipload. Skilled carpenters, caulkers, and sailmakers labor in covered dry docks that can construct and launch dozens of war galleys simultaneously. Each galley stretches roughly 40 meters in length, propelled by banks of oars and armed with a forward-mounted cannon. The arsenal's capacity is staggering. In times of urgent need, it produces new vessels within weeks. On the 28th of September, 1538, Barbarossa's fleet meets the combined naval forces of the Holy League, Venice, Spain, the Papal States, and Genoa at the Battle of Preveza off the western coast of Greece. The Allied fleet, commanded by the Genoese admiral Andrea Doria, outnumbers the Ottomans, yet Barbarossa's tactical brilliance proves decisive. He exploits wind and current, pins the Allied galleys against the coastline, and shatters their formation. Doria withdraws without committing his full strength, and the eastern Mediterranean passes under Ottoman control for a generation. Trade routes from Alexandria to the Adriatic now flow through Ottoman-dominated waters. Barbarossa dies in 1546, but the naval infrastructure he built endures. His successors, Turgut Reis, who captures Tripoli in 1551, and Piale Pasha, who ravages Christian outposts across the central Mediterranean, extend Ottoman maritime reach. The conquest of Cyprus in 1570 and 1571, wresting the island from Venice after a brutal siege of Famagusta, demonstrates that Ottoman naval ambition remains undiminished. Yet Cyprus provokes a response. Pope Pius V assembles a new Holy League, and on the 7th of October, 1571, more than 400 galleys collide in the Gulf of Patras near Lepanto. The Allied fleet, commanded by Don John of Austria, deploys heavily armed galleasses, floating gun platforms that devastate the Ottoman vanguard. The battle becomes a close-quarters slaughter of extraordinary ferocity. By nightfall, the Ottoman fleet is destroyed, nearly 200 vessels sunk or captured, 30,000 men dead or enslaved. The defeat shocks the empire but does not break it. The Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha reportedly tells the Venetian envoy that while the Holy League has merely singed the Ottoman beard, the empire has cut off Venice's arm by taking Cyprus. Within months, the Tusain launches a replacement fleet of over 150 galleys. By 1572, Ottoman warships again patrol the eastern Mediterranean. Lepanto proves a tactical disaster, but not a strategic catastrophe. The empire retains Cyprus, holds North Africa, and continues to project naval power across waters that have carried its flag for decades. The sea remains contested, but the crescent banner still flies from mast after mast along the horizon. Behind the walls of Topkapi Palace, beyond the Gate of Felicity, where even grand viziers pause before entering, a labyrinth of corridors, courtyards, and tiled chambers houses the institution that quietly reshapes Ottoman politics for over a century. The harem is no ornamental cage. It is a school of governance, a network of alliances, and a crucible where the future of the dynasty is forged. The transformation begins with a woman whose birth name is lost to history. Captured from the Ruthenian lands of what is now western Ukraine, she enters the imperial household as a slave and emerges as the most powerful woman the Ottoman world has ever known. Hürrem Sultan, called Roxolana by European ambassadors, accomplishes what no concubine before her dares to attempt. She becomes the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, shattering a centuries-old Ottoman tradition that forbids sultans from marrying. She bears him 6 children, and her influence extends far beyond the bedchamber. She corresponds with foreign monarchs, including Sigismund of Poland. She commissions the Haseki Sultan complex in Istanbul, a mosque, madrasa, hospital, and soup kitchen serving the poor, establishing a model of female architectural patronage that her successors will follow. Hürrem's political acumen proves decisive in the succession crisis that consumes Suleiman's later years. The rivalry between Prince Mustafa, son of another concubine, and Hürrem's own sons reshapes the dynasty's future. Mustafa is executed in 1553 on suspicion of conspiracy, and Hürrem's son Selim eventually inherits the throne. After Suleiman dies on campaign in 1566, the center of gravity within the palace shifts permanently. Nurbanu Sultan, the Venetian-born mother of Murad III, becomes the first in a succession of Valide sultans who wield authority rivaling that of grand viziers. The Valide sultans' apartments in the harem, decorated with the finest Iznik tiles in cobalt blue and turquoise, become the nerve center of imperial decision-making. Nurbanu maintains secret correspondence with Venice, shaping Ottoman foreign policy from behind cedarwood lattice screens. Safia Sultan succeeds her as the dominant female figure during the reign of Mehmed III. She influences appointments of grand viziers and provincial governors, and foreign ambassadors seek her intercession. The English Queen Elizabeth sends her personal gifts, recognizing where true influence resides. The apex of female power arrives with Kösem Sultan, perhaps the most formidable political figure of the 17th century Ottoman court. Of Greek origin, she serves as regent for two of her sons, Murad IV and Ibrahim, and later for her grandson, Mehmed IV. For nearly 3 decades, Kösem navigates factional warfare among janissaries, palace eunuchs, and rival courtiers. She distributes patronage, controls access to the sultan, and funds charitable endowments across the empire. Her power becomes so entrenched that when the young Valid Sultan Turhan Hatish perceives Kösem as a threat to her own son's reign, the confrontation turns lethal. In 1651, Kösem is strangled in the harem by agents loyal to Turhan Hatice, a violent transfer of power that marks both the culmination and the beginning of the end of the Sultanate of Women. Turhan Hatice herself commissions the Yeni Cami, the new mosque at Eminönü, completed in 1665, its cascade of domes and minarets rising above the waterfront markets. The mosque stands as a monument to the architectural ambition of these women, who collectively endow more public works than many sultans. The harem's tiled walls, geometric patterns in coral red, sage green, and deep blue, witness the quiet machinery of empire. Mother-of-pearl inlaid doors open onto councils where the fate of provinces is decided. The institution produces not merely heirs, but statesmen, trained from childhood in languages, administration, and the arts of rule. The women who govern this world leave their mark not in battlefield chronicles, but in stone, ceramic, and endowment deed, their influence woven into the empire's fabric as surely as gold thread through imperial silk. The empire's grandeur is measured not only in conquered provinces and soaring domes, but in the ceaseless rhythm of commerce that pulses through its covered streets. Istanbul's Grand Bazaar expanded throughout the 16th century into a labyrinth of 61 vaulted corridors and more than 3,000 shops, stands as the beating commercial heart of a civilization spanning 3 continents. Sunlight filters through small openings in the stone ceilings, casting pale circles onto bolts of Bursa silk, mounds of saffron from Persia, leather worked in the tanneries of the Yedikul district, and silver filigree from Balkan workshops. Each street belongs to a single trade. The jewelers cluster beneath one arcade, the carpet merchants beneath another, the spice sellers in their own fragrant corridor, where cinnamon, clove, and black pepper perfume the heavy air. The guild system governs this world with meticulous precision. Every craft, from coppersmiths to candle makers, operates under the authority of its esnaf, a self-regulating body that sets prices, enforces quality standards, and limits the number of practitioners. A young apprentice enters a guild under a master's supervision, progressing through years of training before receiving permission to open his own shop. The Kethuda, or guild warden, mediates disputes and represents the trade before imperial authorities. The Muhtasib, a market inspector appointed by the state, patrols the bazaars to ensure honest weights and fair dealing. Violations bring public shaming, fines, or expulsion from the trade. Beyond the bazaar's stone walls, the hammam anchors the social architecture of every Ottoman neighborhood. Domed steam rooms rise above the streets, their ceilings pierced with star-shaped glass openings that scatter colored light across wet marble. The hammam serves purposes far exceeding hygiene. It is where marriages are negotiated, friendships sustained, and the rituals of birth and death observed. Women's hours transform the bathhouse into a world apart, where mothers evaluate prospective brides and news travels faster than any imperial courier. The great hammams commissioned by sultans and their families, the Chembalitash hammam designed by Mimar Sinan, the Haseki Hurrem Sultan hammam near the Hagia Sophia, combine engineering sophistication with social purpose, their hypercoursed heating systems channeling hot air beneath marble floors. By the 1550s, a new institution appears that will reshape Ottoman public life. The coffee house, serving a bitter black drink brewed from beans imported through Yemen, spreads rapidly through Istanbul and the provincial capitals. These establishments, furnished with low wooden benches and simple reed mats, become arenas of storytelling, poetry recitation, backgammon, and increasingly political conversation. The authorities regard them with suspicion. Grand viziers periodically attempt to close them, citing idleness and sedition, yet the coffee houses persist and multiply, numbering in the hundreds across Istanbul by the early 17th century. Along the empire's vast trade routes, caravanserais provide shelter for merchants traveling between Aleppo and Bursa, Cairo and Edirne. These fortified stone complexes, spaced a day's journey apart, offer stabling for animals, secure storage for goods, and sleeping quarters arranged around open courtyards. The great khans within cities serve similar functions, their upper galleries housing visiting traders, while ground-floor chambers operate as wholesale markets. Goods flow through these networks in staggering volume. Istanbul alone consumes hundreds of thousands of sheep annually, along with vast quantities of grain shipped from Egypt and the Black Sea coast. The ordinary Ottoman subject inhabits a world structured by guild, neighborhood, and faith, governed by rhythms of prayer, market, and season. Hammered copper trays carry food to communal tables. Cedarwood lattice screens shade windows from the summer heat. The call to prayer marks the passage of hours as reliably as any clock. This is an empire experienced not through imperial edicts, but through the texture of daily bread, the warmth of heated marble, and the aroma of roasting coffee drifting through narrow streets at dusk. The empire that governs through bread and bathwater also governs through prayer. In every Ottoman city, the soundscape itself declares the architecture of faith, the muezzin's call rising from minarets at dawn, church bells tolling in Greek and Armenian quarters, the murmur of Hebrew liturgy behind synagogue walls in Salonika. This coexistence is neither accidental nor utopian. It is administered, codified, and taxed. The millet system provides the framework. Each recognized religious community, the Rum millet of Greek Orthodox Christians, the Armenian Apostolic millet, and the Jewish millet, operates under the authority of its own spiritual leader, who answers directly to the Sultan's government. The ecumenical patriarch, seated in the Fena district of Istanbul, adjudicates marriage, inheritance, and education for Orthodox Christians across the empire. Armenian bishops perform similar functions from their patriarchate. Chief rabbis govern Jewish communal affairs in cities from Salonika to Baghdad. These leaders collect taxes from their communities, maintain courts for civil disputes, and bear personal responsibility for their flock's loyalty to the Ottoman state. Non-Muslims pay the seizi, a poll tax that simultaneously marks their subordinate status and guarantees their protection. They are exempt from military service. Their neighborhoods cluster around their houses of worship. stone churches with modest exteriors concealing gilded iconostases within, synagogues whose interiors glow with carved wood and hanging oil lamps. Building restrictions limit the height and visibility of non-Muslim religious structures, yet the communities flourish. Salonica's Jewish population, swelled by Sephardic refugees welcomed after 1492, transforms the city into a center of Ladino culture, printing, and textile production. Above the entire religious apparatus stands the Shaykhul Islam, the supreme Islamic legal authority. Appointed by the Sultan, this scholar issues fatwas, formal legal opinions, on matters ranging from taxation to warfare, from the permissibility of coffee to the legitimacy of deposing a sovereign. No major policy decision proceeds without the Shaykhul Islam's endorsement. The office occupies a position without parallel in contemporary European states, fusing theological scholarship with political power in a single institutional role. The madrases, theological colleges attached to mosque complexes, train the scholars, judges, and jurists who staff the empire's Islamic legal system. Students study Quranic exegesis, hadith, jurisprudence, logic, and Arabic grammar within stone-vaulted chambers arranged around quiet courtyards. The grandest madrases, those flanking the Suleimaniya and Fatih complexes, produce the qadis who administer justice in provincial courts from Bosnia to Yemen. Yet Ottoman spiritual life extends far beyond the formal hierarchy of scholars and judges. The Sufi orders penetrate every level of society. In Konya, the Mevlevi dervishes perform the Sema, a whirling meditation in white robes and tall felt hats, spinning with one palm raised toward heaven and the other turned toward earth, channeling divine grace into the material world. The ceremony unfolds in the Semahaneh, a polished wooden hall where the only sounds are the plaintive cry of the ney flute and the soft percussion of bare feet on boards. The Bektashi order maintains an even more pervasive influence. Formerly affiliated with the Janissary Corps since its founding, the Bektashi lodges serve as spiritual homes for soldiers, incorporating elements of Shia reverence for Ali, Christian-influenced rituals, and folk mysticism into a heterodox synthesis that horrifies Orthodox scholars yet binds the military elite in bonds of fraternity and devotion. Bektashi tekkes, lodges, dot Anatolia and the Balkans, their kitchens feeding the poor, their sheikhs counseling the troubled. The Naqshbandi order, more orthodox in its orientation, emphasizes silent meditation and strict adherence to Islamic law, attracting scholars and merchants who seek spiritual depth within the boundaries of Sunni propriety. Each order maintains its own chain of spiritual transmission, its own rituals, its own architectural spaces, from humble village lodges to grand urban complexes with libraries, hospices, and tombs of founding saints draped in green cloth and illuminated by silver candlesticks. This layered system, millets governing their own, the Shaykhul Islam presiding over Islamic law, Sufi orders nourishing the inner life of millions, creates a civilization where faith is simultaneously personal devotion and imperial infrastructure. Mosques, churches, and synagogues share city blocks. The empire does not demand uniformity of belief. It demands order, revenue, and loyalty, and in return it offers each community the space to worship, teach, and judge according to its own traditions. The empire feeds its people before it commands them. In the vast kitchens of Topkapi Palace, a complex of 10 domed chambers topped with chimneys that exhale wood smoke into the Bosphorus breeze. Nearly 800 cooks and their assistants labor from before dawn. Copper cauldrons the size of bathing basins simmer with lamb stews perfumed with cinnamon and dried apricots. Rows of kebabs turn over charcoal beds, their fat hissing against embers. Rice pilafs, each grain separate and glistening with clarified butter, emerge from lidded pots in quantities sufficient to feed 5,000 mouths daily. The Sultan, his household, the pages of the palace school, the gardeners, the gatekeepers, and the silent corps of eunuchs who guard the inner courts. Ottoman cuisine is not invented but assembled, a synthesis of traditions carried from the Central Asian steppe, refined in Persian courts, enriched by Arab spice roots, and layered with Byzantine techniques of preservation and fermentation. Burek, thin sheets of dough filled with cheese or minced meat, descends from Turkic nomadic cooking adapted to palace ovens. Sherbets of rose, tamarind, and sour cherry cool the throats of courtiers in summer, served in jeweled goblets chilled with snow hauled from the peaks of Uludağ. Confectioners shape marzipan into fruit, fold baklava into 40 layers of tissue-thin pastry drenched in honey, and sculpt sugar into architectural fantasies for banquet centerpieces. The palace kitchens maintain separate sections for soups, for halva, for jams, for beverages, each supervised by a master whose rank within the household hierarchy is precisely defined. Beyond the palace walls, the empire's material wealth is woven into fabric. In Bursa, the first Ottoman capital nestled beneath its mountain, silk looms clatter in workshops lining the Kozahan, the cocoon caravansary where raw silk arrives from Iranian and Chinese sources along routes the Ottomans now control. Bursa velvet, kemha, heavy with gold and silver thread, drapes the shoulders of sultans and the walls of throne rooms. The patterns are unmistakable: stylized tulips, carnations, pomegranates, and the Chintamani motif of 3 dots and paired wavy lines, repeated across bolts of crimson, emerald, and ivory. These textiles travel westward, coveted by Venetian merchants who resell them to European aristocracy at enormous profit. Bursa's silk revenues constitute one of the empire's most reliable sources of wealth, taxed at every stage from cocoon to finished cloth. The same civilization that feeds and clothes its subjects also sings to them. Ottoman classical music operates within the makam system, a framework of melodic modes, each carrying its own emotional color, its own prescribed intervals and characteristic phrases. The makam rast conveys joy and openness. The makam Husseini suggests longing. Court musicians trained in the Enderun Palace School or in Mevlevi lodges perform on the ney, the breathy reed flute whose hollow tone is said to express the soul's separation from the divine. The tanba, a long-necked lute plucked with a plectrum of tortoise shell, and the kanun, a flat zither whose 72 strings shimmer beneath nimble fingers. Compositions follow cyclical rhythmic patterns called usul, some spanning over 100 beats before repeating. In the studios of palace miniaturists, pigments ground from lapis lazuli, malachite, and vermilion are mixed with gum arabic and applied with brushes of single cat hairs to pages of polished paper. These artists illustrate histories, genealogies, and festival books with scenes of extraordinary precision: armies on the march, gardens in bloom, sultans enthroned beneath canopies of gold. Perspective is deliberately flattened, figures arranged in hierarchical scale, the world rendered not as the eye sees it, but as the mind comprehends it. Alongside the miniaturists, calligraphers practice the 6 canonical scripts, their reed pens cutting letters that flow like water across the page. Ebru masters float pigments on thickened water, drawing needles through color to create marbled patterns of infinite variation, each sheet unique and unrepeatable. These arts of the kitchen, the loom, the reed flute, and the brush are not luxuries appended to empire. They are the empire's connective tissue, binding provinces to capital, subject to sovereign, the earthly to the sacred. The empire that once shattered the walls of Constantinople now finds its own foundations trembling. By the middle of the 17th century, decades of palace intrigue, child sultans manipulated by factions, and a treasury drained by prolonged campaigns have left the Ottoman state dangerously weakened. Provincial governors ignore directives from Istanbul. The Janissary Corps, once the empire's sharpest blade, has devolved into a privileged caste, more interested in protecting commercial interests than marching to war. The vast machinery of conquest has rusted from within. Into this crisis steps a 70-year-old Albanian-born statesman named Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, appointed Grand Vizier in 1656 under conditions unprecedented in Ottoman history. He demands and receives absolute authority over civil and military affairs. His purges are swift and merciless. Thousands of corrupt officials, rebellious soldiers, and seditious preachers are executed or exiled. Fiscal discipline returns. The army, reorganized and resupplied, resumes offensive operations. When Köprülü Mehmed dies in 1661, his son Fazıl Ahmed Pasha inherits the vizierate at 26, continuing his father's iron governance with a scholar's refinement. Fazıl Ahmed's greatest triumph unfolds on the island of Crete. The siege of Candia, begun in 1648, has dragged on for over 2 decades, the longest siege in recorded history. Venetian defenders supplied by sea resist with extraordinary tenacity. Fazıl Ahmed personally takes command, tightening the blockade, directing relentless bombardment against the star-shaped bastions. In 1669, Candia finally surrenders. The Ottoman crescent rises over the last major Venetian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. Yet the Köprülü revival carries within it the seeds of catastrophe. In 1683, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a Köprülü protégé consumed by ambition, marches an army of perhaps 150,000 men toward Vienna, the Habsburg capital. The Ottoman encampment spreads across the fields before the city in a vast crescent of tents, trenches, and artillery positions. For 2 months, sappers tunnel beneath Vienna's walls, while defenders ration gunpowder and bread. The city teeters on the edge of collapse. On the 12th of September, 1683, relief arrives with devastating force. Polish King John III Sobieski leads a coalition army down the wooded slopes of the Kahlenberg Heights. The charge of the Polish winged hussars, 18,000 cavalry sweeping downhill in the largest mounted assault in European history, shatters the Ottoman lines. Kara Mustafa's army disintegrates into panicked retreat, abandoning tents, cannons, supplies, and the Grand Vizier's own treasury. Kara Mustafa is executed by strangulation on the Sultan's orders in Belgrade that December, the silk cord tightening around the neck of Ottoman overreach. The defeat at Vienna unleashes a cascade of losses. The Holy League, Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia presses the offensive on every front. Habsburg armies recapture Buda in 1686, after a century and a half of Ottoman rule. The Morea falls to Venice. Russian forces under Peter I seize the fortress of Azov on the Black Sea. Ottoman armies, demoralized and outgunned by European forces now equipped with superior musketry and field artillery, retreat across Hungary, Transylvania, and the Peloponnese. The Treaty of Karlowitz, signed on the 26th of January 1699 in the Serbian town of Sremski Karlovci, formalizes the catastrophe. Hungary and Transylvania pass to the Habsburgs. The Morea goes to Venice. Podolia returns to Poland. For the first time in Ottoman history, the empire signs a treaty not as victor dictating terms, but as a defeated power ceding vast European territories. The psychological wound cuts deeper than any battlefield loss. The Ottoman political imagination, built on the assumption of perpetual expansion, confronts an unfamiliar reality. The empire can shrink. The frontier that once advanced relentlessly westward has reversed direction, and the long retreat has begun. The shock of Karlowitz settles into the empire's bones like a winter that refuses to end. In the opening years of the 18th century, Ottoman statesmen confront a question no previous generation needed to ask. What does an empire do when it can no longer conquer? The answer, tentative and fragile, arrives not on a battlefield but in a garden. Under Sultan Ahmed III and his ambitious Grand Vizier, Nevşehirli Damad Ibrahim Pasha, the empire turns inward, seeking renewal through beauty and borrowed knowledge. Along the shores of the Golden Horn, the pleasure palace of Sadabad rises in the 1720s, its gardens planted with thousands of tulip varieties in cascading beds of crimson, violet, saffron, and white. The tulip, already beloved in Ottoman culture for centuries, becomes the defining symbol of an era. Nocturnal festivals illuminate the palace grounds with candles nestled among the blossoms, their light reflected in shallow marble pools. Tortoises carrying small lanterns on their shells wander through the flower beds, creating rivers of moving flame. Yet beneath the petals lies a serious ambition. Ottoman ambassadors dispatched to Paris and Vienna return with detailed reports on European institutions, military academies, and manufacturing techniques. Yirmiseki's Çelebi Mehmed Efendi's embassy to France in 1720 produces a celebrated account of Versailles, French gardens, and the Paris Observatory. His observations circulate among the Ottoman elite, seeding curiosity about Western methods. The most consequential innovation emerges from a Hungarian-born convert named Ibrahim Mutaferrika. In 1727, he establishes the first Ottoman printing press using movable Arabic type. The press produces works on geography, history, navigation, and military science, 17 titles in its first decade. Religious texts remain excluded, reserved for the calligraphers whose sacred craft the state protects. The output is modest, the print runs small, but the principle is revolutionary. Knowledge, once confined to manuscript copies produced over months, can now be multiplied in days. The tulip period's elegance masks deepening social tensions. The Grand Vizier's lavish spending, rising taxes, and perceived moral laxity provoke fury among artisans and soldiers. In 1730, an Albanian former janissary named Patrona Halil leads a violent uprising in Istanbul. Mobs storm through the streets. Ibrahim Pasha is executed. Ahmed III abdicates in favor of his nephew Mahmud I. The tulip gardens are trampled. The experiment in cultural openness collapses in a single week of bloodshed, demonstrating how fiercely Ottoman society resists transformation imposed from above. The decades following the revolt bring intermittent reform and persistent military decline. Wars against Russia, Austria, and Persia consume resources and territory. The Russian Empire under Catherine the Great emerges as the Ottomans' most dangerous adversary. Russian armies push southward toward the Black Sea, a body of water the Ottomans had treated as an internal lake for 3 centuries. The Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774 delivers a devastating verdict. Russian naval forces, sailing from the Baltic, destroy the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Cheshme in 1770. Russian armies overrun the Crimean Khanate, the Ottomans' most important vassal state on the northern Black Sea shore. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, signed on the 21st of July, 1774, reshapes the geopolitical landscape. The Crimean Khanate gains nominal independence, a transparent prelude to Russian annexation, which follows in 1783. Russia secures navigation rights on the Black Sea and through the Turkish Straits. Most ominously, a clause grants Russia a vague right to make representations on behalf of Orthodox Christian subjects within Ottoman domains. This provision, elastic in its interpretation, becomes a diplomatic weapon that Russia will wield for the next century, justifying repeated intervention in Ottoman internal affairs. The empire that planted tulips seeking renewal now faces a starker reality. The printing press sits largely idle. The pleasure palaces decay. The Black Sea, once an Ottoman sanctuary, carries foreign warships. Between the crushed petals of 1730 and the humiliating treaty of 1774, the Ottoman state has learned that admiring European innovations is not the same as absorbing them, and that the cost of failed reform may be measured not in gardens lost, but in seas surrendered. The lesson of surrendered seas demands a response, and it arrives in the person of a young sultan who ascends the throne in 1789 with visions of a remade empire. Selim III inherits a state bleeding from its latest war with Russia and Austria, its armies outmatched by European formations that move with disciplined precision, while Ottoman forces still rely on the increasingly anarchic Janissary corps. The Sultan's answer is the Nizam-i-Sedid, the New Order, a parallel military force trained by French advisors in European drill, equipped with modern muskets and bayonets, dressed in fitted uniforms that replace the flowing robes of traditional Ottoman soldiery. Barracks rise along the Bosphorus at Levant and Üsküdar, where recruits drawn from Anatolian peasantry practice volley fire and bayonet charges on grounds that smell of fresh-cut timber and gunpowder. The Nizam-i-Sedid numbers perhaps 30,000 soldiers at its peak, funded by new treasury revenues that bypass the old fiscal channels controlled by entrenched interests. But every musket issued to the new force is perceived as a threat by the Janissaries, whose ancient privileges, tax exemptions, artisan trades conducted from barracks, hereditary enrollment of men who never drill, have transformed them from elite warriors into a turbulent urban militia. In 1807, Janissary-allied rebels and conservative ulama launch a revolt in Istanbul. Selim is deposed. His cousin Mustafa IV is placed on the throne. The reformist Grand Vizier Alemdar Mustafa Pasha marches from the Danubian provinces to restore Selim, but arrives too late. Selim is strangled in the palace in 1808. Alemdar installs Mahmud II, Selim's surviving heir, but is himself killed when Janissaries storm his residence, and he detonates his own powder magazine rather than surrender. Mahmud II survives, and he waits. For 18 years he cultivates loyalties, places trusted men in key positions, and quietly builds a new military unit called the Eşkinci Corps. On June 15, 1826, when Janissaries overturn their soup kettles in the traditional signal of revolt, Mahmud is ready. He unfurls the sacred banner of the Prophet, rallies loyal artillery units and the population of Istanbul, and orders cannons turned on the Janissary barracks in the Hippodrome district. The bombardment reduces the ancient barracks to smoking rubble. Thousands of Janissaries perish in the flames, and subsequent executions, estimates range from 6,000 to 10,000 dead. Mahmud abolishes the corps entirely, erasing an institution that had served and plagued the empire for nearly 5 centuries. He names the event the Auspicious Incident. With the Janissaries destroyed, Mahmud remakes the Ottoman state with fierce urgency. He establishes a new conscript army trained along Prussian lines, replaces the turban with the fez as mandatory headwear for officials, founds a government gazette, creates a postal service, and sends students to European capitals. Yet the empire fractures even as its center reforms. The Greek War of Independence, erupting in 1821, draws intervention from Britain, France, and Russia, whose combined naval forces destroy the Ottoman-Egyptian fleet at Navarino in 1827. The Treaty of Adrianople in 1829 compels the empire to recognize Greek independence, the first Christian nation to break free from Ottoman sovereignty. More dangerous still is Muhammad Ali of Egypt, nominally an Ottoman governor, who has built a modernized army and navy that defeats Ottoman forces in Syria in 1831 and 1839. Only European diplomatic intervention prevents Muhammad Ali from marching on Istanbul itself. The empire is saved by the very powers whose military techniques it struggles to adopt. Mahmud II dies on July 1, 1839, just weeks before his young son Abdülmecid issues the Gülhane Edict that will inaugurate the next great wave of reform. The Sultan who burned the Janissary barracks and forced the fez upon reluctant heads does not live to see whether his violent modernization will prove sufficient. The ashes of the old barracks have cooled, but the questions they raised, whether an empire can remake itself fast enough to survive, still smolder in every corridor of the palace on the Bosphorus. On the 3rd day of November, 1839, a 16-year-old Sultan's foreign minister stands in a pavilion at the edge of Gülhane Park, beneath the outer walls of Topkapi Palace, and reads aloud a document that promises to remake the Ottoman world. The Gülhane Edict, drafted by the reformist Grand Vizier Mustafa Reşid Pasha, guarantees the life, honor, and property of every Ottoman subject, Muslim, Christian, and Jew alike. It pledges fair taxation, regular military conscription, and public trials. Ambassadors from European capitals stand among the assembled dignitaries, their presence a quiet acknowledgement that this decree is addressed as much to London and Paris as to Istanbul. Young Abdülmecid I, frail in constitution but earnest in conviction, empowers a generation of reformist bureaucrats to translate these promises into law. New penal codes modeled on French jurisprudence replace arbitrary punishment. Commercial courts open to adjudicate disputes between Ottoman and foreign merchants. Provincial administration is reorganized, with governors answerable to Istanbul through standardized regulations. Secular schools, the Rushdiye middle schools, and later the Idadi preparatory academies, begin producing a new class of Ottoman civil servants trained in geography, mathematics, and foreign languages alongside traditional Islamic sciences. The Crimean War accelerates the transformation. When Russia invades the Danubian principalities in 1853, Britain and France ally with the Ottoman Empire to check Russian expansion. Ottoman soldiers fight alongside European troops at Sevastopol. The war costs hundreds of thousands of lives, but it purchases the empire a seat at the concert of Europe. The Treaty of Paris in 1856 guarantees Ottoman territorial integrity and admits the empire into the European diplomatic system. Weeks before the treaty, the Reform Edict of 1856 deepens the Tanzimat's promises, explicitly declaring equality between Muslims and non-Muslims in education, government employment, and military service. Along the Bosphorus shore, a palace rises that embodies the era's aspirations. Dolmabahce Palace, completed in 1856 at a staggering cost of 5 million Ottoman gold lira, replaces the ancient Topkapi as the seat of imperial power. Its crystal staircase, its 14 tons of gold leaf, its chandelier gifted by Queen Victoria weighing 4.5 tons, all announce that the Ottoman dynasty intends to stand as equals among European monarchs. Baroque facades of white marble stretch for 600 meters along the waterfront. Yet the reforms carry contradictions that no edict can resolve. Conservative ulama resist the erosion of Islamic legal supremacy. Muslim subjects resent the elevation of Christians to legal equality, while Christian communities find the promises insufficient and continue pressing for national independence. Serbia gains increasing autonomy. Romania's principalities unite in 1859. Cretan revolts flare repeatedly. The very equality the Tanzimat proclaims sharpens communal identities rather than dissolving them. The financial cost of modernization proves devastating. Ottoman borrowing from European banks begins in 1854 to fund the Crimean War and never ceases. By 1875, the empire's external debt reaches 200 million British pounds. Abdulaziz, who succeeds Abdulmajid in 1861, spends lavishly on palaces and an ironclad navy while revenues stagnate. In October 1875, the Ottoman government declares partial default on its debt, a humiliation that invites European financial control and deepens the empire's dependency on the very powers it seeks to emulate. The Tanzimat produces a vibrant intellectual awakening, even as the state falters. The young Ottomans, Namık Kemal, Ziya Pasha, Ibrahim Shinasi, publish newspapers advocating constitutional government, blending Islamic political thought with European liberalism. Ottoman literature shifts from classical court poetry toward novels, plays, and journalism that address ordinary life. The telegraph connects Istanbul to every provincial capital. Railroads begin threading through Anatolia and the Balkans. By 1876, the empire trembles under nationalist revolts in Bosnia and Bulgaria, European diplomatic pressure, and fiscal collapse. The reformers' great gamble that modernization could preserve the empire remains unresolved, its answer deferred to a constitution not yet written and a parliament not yet convened. The constitution arrives in December of 1876, proclaimed by a sultan who has occupied the throne for mere months. Abdulhamid II, 34 years old, ascends amid crisis, Serbia and Montenegro at war with the empire, Bulgarian provinces in revolt, European powers demanding intervention. The Kanun-i Asasi, drafted largely by Midhat Pasha and a commission of reformers, establishes a bicameral parliament, guarantees individual liberties, and enshrines Ottoman citizenship regardless of faith. For the first time in 6 centuries of dynastic rule, elected representatives gather in a chamber within the old Turan palace, debating taxation, education, and provincial governance. The experiment lasts 14 months. In April of 1877, Russia declares war. Russian armies pour across the Danube and through the Caucasus simultaneously. The fortress of Plevna, defended by Osman Pasha for 5 agonizing months, becomes a symbol of Ottoman resilience, but its fall in December opens the road to Istanbul. By January of 1878, Russian forces reach the village of San Stefano, within sight of the capital's minarets. The Treaty of San Stefano, signed in March, creates a vast Bulgarian state stretching to the Aegean, effectively a Russian satellite. European alarm at Russian expansion forces a revision at the Congress of Berlin that summer, where Bismarck brokers a compromise. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gain full independence. Bulgaria becomes an autonomous principality. Austria-Hungary occupies Bosnia-Herzegovina. Britain takes Cyprus. The empire hemorrhages territory across the Balkans in a single devastating year. Abdul Hamid suspends the constitution in February of 1878, prorogues parliament indefinitely, and exiles Midhat Pasha, who later dies under mysterious circumstances in a prison in Taif. The Sultan withdraws from the ceremonial grandeur of Dolmabahce to the fortified compound of Yildiz Palace, perched on a hill above the Bosphorus. Behind its high walls and guarded gardens, he constructs a private world of carpentry workshops, a theatre, a photography studio, and an elaborate intelligence network. Thousands of informants, the Hafiyeh, report on military officers, provincial governors, journalists, and foreign diplomats. Censorship tightens around the press. Words like liberty, constitution, and tyranny vanish from Ottoman publications. Yet the autocrat modernizes relentlessly. Telegraph lines multiply until they web every corner of the empire, and Abdul Hamid personally reads decoded dispatches deep into the night. Schools proliferate, military academies, medical colleges, veterinary institutes, civil service training centers, producing the very educated class that will eventually overthrow him. The Hejaz Railway, financed largely by donations from Muslims worldwide, begins construction in 1900. Its narrow-gauge tracks stretching southward from Damascus through the volcanic basalt of the Huran, across the desert of the Hejaz, reaching Medina by 1908. The railway carries pilgrims to the holy cities in days rather than the weeks demanded by camel caravan, binding the empire's Arab provinces to Istanbul through steel and steam, while broadcasting the Sultan's claim as Caliph and protector of Islam. The Armenian massacres of 1894 through 1896 cast a long shadow. In the eastern provinces, intercommunal tensions, heavy taxation, and the activities of Armenian revolutionary organizations provoke a state response of devastating brutality. Tens of thousands perish. European newspapers publish graphic accounts, and the Sultan earns the epithet the Red Sultan in the Western press, even as he cultivates pan-Islamic solidarity across Asia and Africa. The paradox of Abdul Hamid's reign sharpens with each passing year. The schools he builds teach students to read the forbidden political tracts smuggled from Paris and Geneva. The telegraph he cherishes carries coded messages between conspirators. In Salonika, in Damascus, in the military academies of Istanbul, young officers and intellectuals organize in secret cells, dreaming of the constitution gathering dust in the archives of Yildiz Palace. Those secret cells in Salonika ripen in the summer heat of 1908. In July, officers of the Committee of Union and Progress march through the Macedonian hills, demanding the restoration of the constitution that has gathered dust for 30 years. Telegraph wires hum with ultimatums directed at Yildiz Palace. Abdul Hamid, calculating as ever, yields. On the 23rd of July, the constitution is restored, and jubilant crowds fill the streets of Salonika, Istanbul, Beirut, and Damascus, Muslims, Christians, and Jews embracing in a brief, intoxicating moment of Ottoman fraternity. The euphoria does not last. A counter-revolutionary uprising in April of 1909, supported by reactionary soldiers and religious conservatives, briefly threatens the new order. The Action Army marches from Salonika to Istanbul, crushes the revolt, and deposes Abdul Hamid on the 27th of April. He is sent into exile in Salonika, the very city where the revolution was born. His brother Mehmed V ascends the throne as a constitutional figurehead, and real power flows to the committee. Yet governance proves harder than revolution. The Committee of Union and Progress fractures into factions. A triumvirate gradually consolidates control. Enver Pasha at the Ministry of War, Talat Pasha at the Ministry of the Interior, Kemal Pasha commanding the navy, and later governing Syria. They are young, ambitious, and shaped by the humiliations of imperial decline. Those humiliations multiply with terrifying speed. Italy invades Ottoman Tripolitania in 1911, seizing Libya. Before that wound closes, the Balkan Wars erupt. In October of 1912, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro attack simultaneously. Ottoman armies, poorly supplied and badly coordinated, collapse across Thrace and Macedonia. Edirne falls. Salonika falls. The empire loses nearly all its European territory in a matter of weeks, lands held for 5 centuries. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees stream into Anatolia, carrying stories of dispossession and massacre. The Treaty of London in 1913 and the subsequent Treaty of Bucharest redraw the map. Ottoman Europe shrinks to a sliver of eastern Thrace. The trauma of the Balkan Wars radicalizes the committee's leadership. Enver Pasha, now the dominant figure, looks to Germany for military modernization and alliance. When the great powers of Europe stumble into war in the summer of 1914, the Ottoman Empire signs a secret alliance with Germany on the 2nd of August. On the 29th of October, Ottoman warships, including 2 vessels recently transferred from the German Navy, bombard Russian Black Sea ports, dragging the empire into the conflagration. The war unfolds on multiple fronts. In the Caucasus, Enver Pasha's reckless winter offensive at Sarıkamış in December of 1914 ends in catastrophe. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers freeze to death in the mountain passes. At Gallipoli, however, a different story emerges. When British and French forces land on the peninsula in April of 1915, seeking to force the Dardanelles and capture Istanbul, Ottoman defenders hold the ridgelines with extraordinary tenacity. A divisional commander named Mustafa Kemal rallies his troops at Çukurova, and the Allied campaign grinds into a bloody stalemate. By January of 1916, the invaders withdraw. Gallipoli costs over 80,000 Ottoman dead, but it preserves the capital. Elsewhere, the empire bleeds. In Mesopotamia, British forces advance toward Baghdad. In Palestine, General Allenby's army pushes northward. The Arab Revolt, launched in June of 1916 with British encouragement, tears the Hejaz and Syria from Ottoman control. Behind the scenes, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 secretly partitions Ottoman Arab lands between Britain and France. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 promises a Jewish homeland in Palestine. By the autumn of 1918, the Ottoman armies are shattered. Bulgaria surrenders, exposing Istanbul to invasion from the west. On the 30th of October 1918, Ottoman representatives sign the Armistice of Mudros aboard a British warship in the Aegean. The empire that once commanded 3 continents lays down its arms, its provinces carved away, its capital soon to be occupied by foreign soldiers. The foreign warships arrive like iron ghosts. Through the autumn mist of 1918, British dreadnoughts glide past the minarets of Istanbul, their gun turrets trained on the ancient city. French Marines disembark at Galata. Italian soldiers take positions along the southern coast. The capital of a 6th-century empire sits under foreign occupation, its sultan a prisoner in all but name within the walls of Yildiz Palace. The terms dictated to the broken empire grow harsher with each passing month. Allied commissioners govern Istanbul's affairs. French forces push into Cilicia. Italian troops land at Antalya. And in May of 1919, with Allied encouragement, Greek armies land at Smyrna on the Aegean coast, advancing inland with the stated aim of protecting the Greek population, but carrying the unmistakable ambition of territorial annexation. The landing triggers massacres and chaos in the city's Turkish quarters, and the news travels across Anatolia like wildfire through dry grass. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August of 1920, proposes the annihilation of Ottoman sovereignty over Anatolia itself. Eastern provinces are designated for an Armenian state. A Kurdish autonomous zone is outlined. Greece receives Thrace and administrative control over Smyrna. The straits fall under international authority. What remains is a rump state in north-central Anatolia, landlocked and defenseless. But resistance has already crystallized around a single figure. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, lands at Samsun on the Black Sea coast on the 19th of May, 1919, ostensibly to oversee demobilization. Instead, he organizes congresses at Erzurum and Sivas, forging a nationalist movement that declares the National Pact, a set of principles demanding sovereignty over territories with a Turkish Muslim majority. On the 23rd of April, 1920, the Grand National Assembly convenes in Ankara, a dusty steppe town chosen precisely for its distance from occupied Istanbul. This assembly declares itself the legitimate government of Turkey. The war that follows is fought on multiple fronts with scarce resources. On the eastern frontier, nationalist forces engage Armenian forces, securing borders through the Treaty of Gümrü in December of 1920. In the south, irregular fighters and regular units push French forces from Cilicia, culminating in the Ankara Agreement of 1921. But the existential struggle unfolds in the west against the Greek army, which drives deep into Anatolia, reaching the Sakarya River barely 80 kilometers from Ankara itself. The Battle of Sakarya rages for 22 days in August and September of 1921, one of the longest pitched battles in modern history. Turkish forces, commanded by Mustafa Kemal with the Assembly's authorization as commander-in-chief, hold their ground and force a Greek withdrawal. The tide turns permanently. A year of preparation follows. On the 26th of August, 1922, the Great Offensive begins. At the Battle of Dumlupinar on the 30th of August, the Turkish army shatters the Greek lines in a devastating encirclement. The Greek commander-in-chief is captured. The retreating army burns villages and fields in its wake. Turkish cavalry reaches the Aegean coast. On the 9th of September, nationalist forces enter Smyrna, and the city descends into catastrophic fire and violence that consumes its Greek and Armenian quarters. The military victory transforms the political landscape overnight. The Armistice of Mudanya in October of 1922 halts hostilities. On the 1st of November, the Grand National Assembly abolishes the Sultanate, separating it from the Caliphate. Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman Sultan, slips out of Istanbul on the 17th of November aboard a British warship, carrying little more than personal belongings into exile on the Italian Riviera. Negotiations at Lausanne stretch through months of grueling diplomacy. On the 24th of July, 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne replaces the humiliating Sèvres, recognizing full Turkish sovereignty over Anatolia and eastern Thrace. No reparations are imposed. The capitulations that had granted European powers legal privileges on Ottoman soil for centuries are abolished forever. A new state emerges from the wreckage, its borders drawn not by imperial decree, but by bloodshed across the Anatolian plateau. On the 29th of October, 1923, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara proclaims the Republic of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal, the soldier who held the ridgeline at Gallipoli and drove invading armies from the Anatolian heartland, becomes its first president. The Ottoman dynasty, which had reigned for more than 6 centuries, now belongs to history. The severance is swift and deliberate. On the 3rd of March, 1924, the Assembly abolishes the Caliphate itself. Abdulmecid II, the last Caliph, boards the Orient Express at Satalka station and crosses into exile. With him departs an institution that had linked the Ottoman house to the spiritual leadership of Sunni Islam for over 400 years. The reforms that follow reshape every dimension of public life. The Latin alphabet replaces Arabic script in 1928. The Swiss Civil Code supplants Islamic family law. The fez is banned, the Gregorian calendar adopted, and women receive the right to vote in national elections by 1934. Ataturk's republic constructs its identity by consciously turning away from the imperial past. Yet the Ottoman imprint proves indelible. More than 30 modern nations rise from territories once governed from Istanbul. The borders of Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel trace lines first sketched by Ottoman provincial boundaries and later formalized by European mandate powers. The Balkans carry Ottoman place names, architectural forms, and culinary traditions embedded so deeply that centuries of nationalist reinvention cannot fully erase them. Belgrade's fortress walls, Mostar's bridge, Sarajevo's covered bazaar, these structures speak an Ottoman architectural language still legible across southeastern Europe. In Istanbul, the skyline remains an Ottoman composition. The cascading domes of the Süleymaniye descend toward the Golden Horn exactly as Mimar Sinan designed them in the 16th century. The Zelimiye in Edirne, the blue mosque facing the ancient hippodrome, the tiled chambers of Topkapi Palace, all hold designation as World Heritage Sites, drawing millions of visitors each year. The Iznik tiles lining these interiors, their cobalt blues and coral reds unfaded after 5 centuries, testify to a ceramic art whose chemical formulas were lost and only partially recovered by modern science. Ottoman cuisine suffuses the kitchens of the Eastern Mediterranean. Baklava, börek, dolma, yogurt-based dishes, and the ritual of Turkish coffee belong to a shared culinary inheritance claimed by Turks, Greeks, Arabs, and Balkan peoples alike. The coffeehouse tradition that Ottoman merchants carried from Yemen to Istanbul in the 16th century spread onward to Vienna, Paris, and London, reshaping European social life in ways rarely traced back to their Ottoman origins. The makam musical system still structures classical composition in Turkey and influences folk traditions across the former empire. Ottoman calligraphy adorns museum walls from Washington to Tokyo. Manuscripts illuminated by court painters preserve a visual record of 6 centuries in meticulous miniature detail. Scholars across dozens of disciplines, from architectural history to legal studies, from epidemiology to environmental science, continue mining Ottoman archival records, one of the most extensive documentary collections surviving from any pre-modern state. The Ottoman story resists simple summary. It encompasses the frontier faith of Ghazi warriors and the cosmopolitan sophistication of imperial Istanbul, the brilliance of Sinan's engineering and the brutality of succession wars, the inclusive logic of the millet system, and the violent suppression of nationalist aspirations. It is a story of 623 years, 3 continents, and countless human lives woven into a single, vast, contradictory tapestry. The domes still rise against the evening sky over the Bosphorus, catching the last light as ferries cross the strait below, carrying passengers between 2 continents, just as Ottoman caiques once did, the past not vanished, but absorbed into the living fabric of the present. Thank you for journeying through this complete history of the Ottoman Empire. If these stories have deepened your understanding of the past, consider subscribing so you never miss a new exploration of the civilizations that shaped our world.